The boarding pass trembled in my weathered hands as I stood at the gangway of the Mediterranean Star, watching families stream past me onto the luxury cruise ship. Behind me, Betty Rodriguez squeezed my shoulder with the confidence of someone who had spent 40 years booking dream vacations for other people. Ahead of me stretched 30 days of pure freedom, 7 countries, and the kind of adventure my son Kevin had declared me too fragile to handle. What he didn't know was that Dorothy Mitchell had been planning escapes long before he was born, and this time I wasn't asking for permission. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 weeks ago, I'd been sitting in Kevin's pristine living room in Westbrook Hills, listening to him and his wife Amanda plan their family celebration to Turks and Caicos, while explaining why Grandma Dorothy needed to stay home. Too risky for someone my age, they'd said. Too much sun, too much excitement, too much everything for a 72-year-old widow who should be content with her weekly visits to Ruby's Cafe and her quiet life on Maple Street. They'd patted my hand like I was a child and promised to bring me back a souvenir. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That conversation had been the final straw in 3 years of being slowly relegated to the role of the sweet, helpless grandmother who needed protection from life itself. Ever since my Harold had passed, Kevin and Amanda had been steadily reshaping my existence into something smaller, safer, and infinitely more manageable for their busy schedules. What they failed to understand was that before I became Harold Mitchell's devoted wife and Kevin's careful mother, I had been Dorothy Chen, a young woman who had backpacked through Europe, taught English in rural schools across 3 states, and spoke fluent Spanish, passable French, and enough Italian to charm my way through any Mediterranean port. I had met Harold during my teaching years in Columbus, and our love story had been the kind that required compromise. He was a gentle, steady man who preferred familiar routines and hometown comforts. I was a restless spirit who dreamed of distant shores and foreign languages. Love won, as it often does, and I traded my wanderlust for the deep satisfaction of building a life with someone who cherished me. For 43 years, I had been content with that choice. We'd raised Kevin, tended our garden, and found joy in the quiet rhythms of Millfield life. Harold had been my anchor, and I had been his adventure, bringing the world to him through books, cooking, and stories of the places I'd once seen. But now, standing on this ship with Betty grinning beside me like we were 25 again, I felt the dormant traveler in me stretching and awakening. The Mediterranean Star wasn't just a cruise ship. It was my declaration of independence, my refusal to be diminished by other people's fears, and my reminder to the world that Dorothy Mitchell was far from finished living. The conversation that had sparked this rebellion played in my mind as Betty and I made our way to our stateroom. It had been a Sunday dinner at Kevin's house, the kind of obligatory family gathering where Amanda documented everything for her Instagram followers, while the teenagers, Tyler and Madison, barely looked up from their phones. I'd been telling them about a documentary I'd watched about ancient Rome when Kevin interrupted me mid-sentence. "Mom, you know Amanda and I have been talking about the Turks and Caicos trip for my birthday celebration," he'd said, cutting through my story about Roman aqueducts with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing conversations. "We've decided it's going to be adults only this time. Tyler and Madison are staying with Amanda's parents, and we think it would be best if you stayed home too." The words had hit me like cold water. "Best for whom?" I'd asked, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care. Amanda had jumped in, her voice taking on that overly sweet tone she used when she wanted to seem caring for her social media audience. "We're just worried about you, Dorothy. The heat down there can be overwhelming, and the activities we're planning might be too strenuous. Plus, what if something happened to you while we were so far from good medical facilities?" "I'm 72, not 92, I'd replied, feeling my cheeks flush with indignation. "I walk 3 miles every morning, I volunteer at the library twice a week, and I haven't had so much as a cold in 2 years. What exactly do you think is going to happen to me on a beach vacation? Kevin had sighed, the sound loaded with the patience of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. It's not just about your health, Mom. It's about the dynamic of the trip. Amanda's planned some romantic activities for us, and having you there would change the whole vibe. Plus, the resort we're staying at is really geared toward younger couples. You'd probably be bored. That's when the real truth had emerged. This wasn't about my health or comfort. This was about Kevin and Amanda's image of themselves as a sophisticated, youthful couple whose 72-year-old family member didn't fit the aesthetic they wanted to project. I was an inconvenience, a reminder of aging and mortality that didn't belong in their carefully curated vacation photos. I see, I'd said quietly, and I really had seen. I'd seen how they looked at me when I asked for help reaching something. On a high shelf, not with love and concern, but with irritation at the interruption. I'd seen how Amanda's smile tightened when I shared stories about my teaching days or the places I'd traveled in my youth, as if my past adventures were somehow inappropriate for someone who should be content with decline. I'd seen how Kevin checked his watch whenever I visited, calculating how much of his precious time my presence was costing him. "We'll bring you back something nice," Amanda had added, already scrolling through her phone to show me resort photos that I hadn't asked to see. "Maybe a pretty scarf or some local artwork for your living room. A souvenir. Like I was a pet being left behind, deserving of a treat to make up for missing the real adventure." That night, I'd sat in my small ranch house on Maple Street, surrounded by the accumulation of a lifetime lived mostly within a 50-mile radius, and felt the walls closing in. Not the physical walls of my home, but the invisible barriers my family had constructed around me, designed to keep me safe and manageable and increasingly irrelevant. That's when I'd called Betty Rodriguez, my oldest friend, and the only person who remembered Dorothy Chen, the young woman who had once been brave enough to take trains through strange countries with nothing but a backpack and a phrase book. Betty had listened to my story with the kind of outrage that only a true friend can muster, and then she'd said the words that changed everything. "Dot, I've got an idea. How much do you think Kevin's little resort vacation is costing him?" I'd done some quick mental math based on the resort photos Amanda had shown me. Probably around $8,000 for the two of them, maybe more with all the activities and dining they're planning. "Okay. And how much do you think you've got tucked away in that savings account you never talk about? The one from your Aunt Margaret's inheritance plus all those years of teacher pension investments that Harold was so proud of?" The question had made me pause. Harold had been meticulous about our finances, and after his death, I'd discovered that decades of careful investing and the substantial inheritance from my childless aunt had left me with considerably more resources than Kevin realized. I'd never made a point of discussing money with him, partly from my generation's habit of financial privacy, and partly because Harold had always handled such matters. But Betty was right. My modest lifestyle and careful spending had allowed a considerable nest egg to grow undisturbed. "Enough," I'd said carefully. "Enough for what, exactly?" Betty had pressed, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Enough for anything I want to do." "Then here's what we're going to do. I'm coming over tomorrow with some brochures, and we're planning ourselves a real vacation. Not some resort where they serve watered-down cocktails and play steel drum music on a loop." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm talking about the kind of trip that would make those travel magazines jealous. What do you say, Dot? Ready to remind everyone who Dorothy Mitchell really is? The next morning, Betty had arrived at my door with a stack of cruise brochures and the enthusiasm of someone half her age. As a former travel agent, she still maintained connections throughout the industry. And within an hour, we'd outlined a 30-day Mediterranean cruise that would make Kevin's Turks and Caicos trip look like a weekend at a suburban hotel. Rome, Barcelona, Monaco, the Greek islands, Betty had said, spreading glossy photos across my kitchen table. Cooking classes in Tuscany, wine tastings in southern France, archaeological tours led by actual professors. This isn't some floating casino, Dot. This is the real thing. I'd studied the itinerary, my heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. It had been so long since I'd planned anything more adventurous than a trip to the grocery store. Could I really do this? Could I navigate foreign airports, communicate in languages I hadn't spoken in decades, manage my medications and mobility in unfamiliar places? As if reading my doubts, Betty had reached across the table and taken my hand. You taught high school Spanish for 30 years, Dot. You've handled teenagers, school administrators, and parent conferences that would make a diplomat weep. You think a cruise ship is going to defeat you? She'd been right, of course. I'd spent my entire career managing complex situations, adapting to changes, and solving problems on the fly. The skills that had made me an effective teacher hadn't disappeared just because I'd retired. They'd simply been dormant, waiting for a challenge worthy of resurrection. The booking process had been remarkably simple. Betty's industry connections had secured us a beautiful stateroom with a balcony at a price that was reasonable for what we were getting, and her experience had guided us through the maze of travel documents, insurance, and logistics that had seemed so daunting from the outside. Within a week, we had boarding passes, shore excursion reservations, and a detailed day-by-day itinerary that read like a sophisticated traveler's dream. The hardest part had been keeping it secret from Kevin and Amanda. Not because I felt guilty about the expense or the independence it represented, but because I wanted to time the revelation for maximum impact. They'd made their assumptions about my limitations and desires based on their own need to see me as helpless and content with less. I wanted them to confront those assumptions directly, publicly, and without the opportunity to talk me out of what I'd already set in motion. So I'd said nothing during our subsequent family dinners, nodding politely when they updated me on their vacation plans and accepting their patronizing reassurances that I'd be much more comfortable staying home. I'd listened to Amanda describe the resort's amenities and Kevin's plans for deep-sea fishing and scuba diving, activities they'd declared unsuitable for someone of my advanced age and limited mobility. All the while, I'd been mentally comparing their conventional resort experience to my upcoming journey through some of the world's most culturally rich and historically significant destinations. The contrast wasn't lost on me. They were choosing comfort and familiarity, the kind of vacation that required no language skills, no cultural adaptation, no intellectual curiosity beyond the resort's activity schedule. I was choosing challenge and growth, the kind of travel that would require me to stretch intellectually, culturally, and personally. And yet, they'd characterized their choice as sophisticated and mine as impossible. 3 days before their departure to Turks and Caicos, I'd finally revealed my plans. I'd invited them over for Sunday dinner, prepared Kevin's favorite pot roast, and waited until dessert to make my announcement. I wanted to let you know that I'll be traveling while you're away, I'd said casually, serving slices of the apple pie I'd made from Harold's mother's recipe. Kevin had looked up from his phone where he'd been checking weather reports for the Caribbean. Traveling? Where are you going, Mom? Visiting Cousin Ruth in Cleveland again? Actually, I'm taking a Mediterranean cruise with Betty. 30 days, 7 countries. We leave on Tuesday. The silence that followed had been profound. Amanda's fork had frozen halfway to her mouth, and Kevin had stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to join the circus. A what? Kevin had finally managed. A cruise. Through the Mediterranean, Rome, Barcelona, the Greek islands, southern France. Betty used to be a travel agent, and she still has wonderful connections in the industry. We got an excellent deal on a stateroom with a balcony. Amanda had recovered first, her social media instincts kicking in. Dorothy, that's wonderful that you're thinking about travel, but don't you think a cruise might be a bit much? I mean, all those foreign countries, the time changes, the language barriers. What if something happens and you need medical attention? Then I'll handle it the same way any other intelligent adult would, I'd replied calmly. The ship has medical facilities, I have travel insurance, and I speak enough Spanish, French, and Italian to communicate basic needs. I managed to travel extensively before I met your father-in-law, and I suspect the skills haven't entirely atrophied. Kevin had leaned forward, his expression shifting from surprise to concern to something that looked suspiciously like control. Mom, this is crazy. You can't just decide to take off on some international vacation without consulting anyone. What about your medications? Your doctor's appointments? What if there's an emergency here at home? My medications are packed and properly labeled. My doctors know I'll be traveling, and Maria Santos next door has my emergency contact information and power of attorney if needed. I've been planning this for weeks, Kevin. It's not an impulse. Decision. The revelation that I'd been planning without their knowledge had seemed to disturb them more than the travel itself. In their minds, I'd stepped outside the boundaries of appropriate behavior for someone in my position. I was supposed to consult them, seek their approval, accept their guidance on matters too complex for my diminished capacities. How are you? Even paying for this? Amanda had asked, and there it was. The real question underlying all their concerns. With my own money, I'd replied simply. But Mom, Kevin had pressed, these cruises cost thousands of dollars. You're on a fixed income. You can't afford to blow your savings on something like this. What about long-term care? What about leaving something for Tyler and Madison? And there it was. The assumption that my money was really their money, held in trust until they needed it or inherited it. The presumption that my savings existed, primarily to serve their future security rather than my present happiness. The belief that I should live on the smallest portion of my resources, denying myself experiences and comfort so that they could eventually benefit from my frugality. I can afford it quite comfortably, I'd said, meeting Kevin's eyes directly. Your father and I were more successful with our investments than you realize, and Aunt Margaret's inheritance was more substantial than you know. I've been living well, within my means for decades, not because I had to, but because I chose to. Now I'm choosing differently. The conversation had deteriorated from there, with Kevin questioning my judgment, Amanda expressing concern about my mental state, and both of them speaking about me as if I weren't present. They'd left that evening frustrated and angry, unable to accept that I was capable of making independent decisions about my own life and resources. The next morning, Kevin had called to tell me he was putting the Turks and Caicos trip on hold to deal with my crisis of judgment. I'd informed him that there was no crisis, that my judgment was sound, and that he should absolutely not change his vacation plans on my account. When he'd insisted on involving my doctor to assess my mental competency, I'd calmly provided him with Dr. Patterson's phone number and suggested he make an appointment to discuss his concerns about his mother's psychological evaluation. Dr. Patterson, who had been treating me for 15 years and knew my history, habits, and capabilities intimately, had apparently given Kevin a brisk lesson in the difference between age-related decline and normal adult autonomy. Kevin had emerged from that conversation chastened and slightly embarrassed, but still convinced that I was making a mistake. Now, as Betty and I explored our stateroom with its ocean view and elegant appointments, I felt nothing but gratitude for that mistake. The room was more luxurious than anywhere I'd stayed since my honeymoon with Harold, and the thought of waking up each morning to a new port, a new country, a new adventure, filled me with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Look, at this bathroom, Betty called from the marble-appointed space that was larger than my bedroom closet at home. I've booked cruises for millionaires who didn't get accommodations this nice. Your friend Frank really came through with these upgrades. Frank Chen, my former teaching colleague who had transitioned from education to the cruise industry, had been instrumental in making this trip extraordinary rather than merely adequate. When Betty had mentioned our plans to him, he'd used his connections to secure upgrades, special dining reservations, and behind-the-scenes tours that weren't available to typical passengers. It was a reminder that relationships built over decades of professional collaboration had value beyond the workplace, and that the network I'd developed as an educator was more extensive and influential than Kevin had ever realized. As we unpacked our luggage, I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had with Tyler and Madison before leaving. My teenage grandchildren had reacted to my travel plans with a mixture of admiration and disbelief that had been far more supportive than their parents' response. "Grandma, that's so cool," Madison had said when I'd shown her the cruise itinerary. "You're going to see the Colosseum and the Parthenon and everything. Can you take lots of pictures for my history project?" Tyler, at 17 and perpetually skeptical of adult decisions, had been more direct. "So basically, Mom and Dad said you couldn't handle their vacation, and you responded by booking something way cooler? That's kind of awesome, actually." Their enthusiasm had meant more to me than Kevin and Amanda's disapproval, partly because it reminded me that the capacity for adventure and growth isn't necessarily diminished by age, and partly because it suggested that the next generation might have a different understanding of what was possible for their elders. The ship's departure had been scheduled for 6 in the evening, giving Betty and me time to explore the vessel and orient ourselves before dinner. The Mediterranean Star was genuinely impressive, with art galleries, libraries, multiple dining venues, and cultural programming that elevated it far above the stereotype of cruise ships as floating buffets. This was travel for people who wanted to learn and experience, not just consume and be entertained. As we walked the promenade deck, watching Barcelona's skyline slide past in the golden evening light, I felt Harold's presence in a way that was comforting rather than sorrowful. He would have been proud of this decision, I realized. Proud that I'd stood up for myself, proud that I'd chosen growth over safety, proud that I was honoring the adventurous spirit he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Penny for your thoughts," Betty said, joining me at the rail as the Spanish coast grew distant. "I was thinking about Harold," I admitted. About how he used to say that the worst thing about getting older wasn't the physical changes, but the way other people started treating you like you'd already died. Betty nodded, her own expression thoughtful. He was a wise man, and he'd be cheering you on right about now. As we headed to dinner in the ship's main dining room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the diminished, cautious grandmother Kevin and Amanda saw. She was Dorothy Mitchell, world traveler, adventure seeker, and living proof that age was just a number when you refused to let other people's limitations become your own. The adventure was just beginning, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt truly alive. The first morning at sea brought revelations I hadn't anticipated. I woke before dawn in my comfortable stateroom, immediately aware of the gentle motion beneath me and the sound of water against the hull. Through the balcony doors, the Mediterranean stretched endlessly in shades of deep blue and silver, unmarked by land or other vessels. For a moment, lying in that luxurious bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, I felt disoriented by the sheer possibility of the day ahead. Betty was already awake, sitting on her balcony with coffee and what appeared to be a detailed ship's newsletter. "Good morning, world traveler," she called softly. "Sleep well?" Better than I had in months, actually. There was something about being in motion, about waking up in a different place than where I'd fallen asleep, that energized me in ways I'd forgotten were possible. At home in Millfield, every morning brought the same view, the same routine, the same careful management of a life designed to avoid surprises. Here, even the horizon was different from the day before. "What's the plan for today?" I asked, joining her on the balcony with my own cup of coffee from the in-room service. "Orientation and exploration," Betty replied, consulting her notes with the thoroughness of someone who had spent decades organizing other people's dream vacations. Ship tour at 10, language refresher sessions in the afternoon, and tonight there's a welcome reception with the shore excursion staff. Tomorrow we dock in Rome, and I want us to be ready. The ship tour revealed amenities that put Kevin and Amanda's luxury resort to shame. The Mediterranean Star had been designed for discerning travelers who wanted cultural enrichment alongside their relaxation. There was a well-stocked library with books in multiple languages, art galleries featuring rotating exhibitions from museums we'd be visiting, and lecture halls where professors and historians would provide context for our destinations. The cooking. School offered classes taught by chefs from each port we'd visit, and the fitness center had programs specifically designed for active older adults. What struck me most forcefully was the demographic of our fellow passengers. These weren't the stereotypical cruise customers I'd imagined, elderly couples shuffling between buffet meals and bingo games. These were educated, engaged people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who had chosen this trip as an intellectual and cultural adventure. I met a retired surgeon from Toronto who spoke 5 languages, a former university chancellor from London who was working on her 3rd historical novel, and a couple from Sydney who had been taking educational cruises for 15 years as their preferred method of exploring the world. During the afternoon language refresher session, I discovered that my Spanish, French, and Italian hadn't deteriorated as much as I'd feared. The instructor, a multilingual professor from Barcelona, complimented my pronunciation and encouraged me to practice with native speakers during our port visits. "You have the foundation," she said after I'd navigated a complex conversation about Roman architecture in Italian. "You simply need confidence to build upon it." Confidence. Such a simple word, but it had been slowly eroded over the past 3 years by well-meaning family members who treated every minor memory lapse as evidence of decline, every physical limitation as proof of fragility. Here, surrounded by peers who expected competence rather than incapacity, I felt that confidence, returning like circulation to a limb that had been asleep too long. The welcome reception that evening provided my first real test of social interaction in an unfamiliar environment. I'd grown accustomed to being the oldest person in most gatherings, the one who needed accommodations and special consideration. On the Mediterranean Star, I was simply another passenger with interests and capabilities worth engaging. The shore excursion coordinator, a dynamic woman named Elena who had been leading Mediterranean tours for 20 years, treated me as an experienced traveler seeking recommendations rather than a nervous novice requiring hand-holding. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, reviewing the excursions Betty and I had pre-booked, "I see you've chosen the advanced archaeological tour in Rome and the intensive cooking class in Barcelona. Excellent choices. Your background in education will serve you well in our more academic offerings." That she knew about my teaching career surprised me, until I realized that Frank Chen had provided the cruise staff with passenger profiles to enhance our experience. Rather than feeling invasive, this attention to detail felt respectful, as if my professional accomplishments mattered in this context, rather than being dismissed as ancient history. "I'm particularly excited about the Vatican private tour," I told Elena. "I've been reading about the restoration work they've been doing in the Sistine Chapel." "Ah, you'll love Professor Romano then. He's been documenting the restoration process for 15 years and provides context that you simply can't get from guidebooks. He only works with small groups, so that tour is quite exclusive." Exclusive. When had I last been part of anything described as exclusive? Kevin and Amanda's social circle certainly didn't include me, and my daily life in Millfield had become increasingly ordinary and predictable. Here, my interests and intelligence were opening doors to experiences that money alone couldn't purchase. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations that challenged and stimulated me in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. A retired professor of classical studies engaged me in a detailed discussion about the influence of Roman engineering on modern infrastructure. A former diplomat shared insights about Mediterranean politics that added depth to our upcoming port. Visits. A couple who had been taking cultural cruises for decades offered practical advice about navigating foreign cities independently. "The key," said Margaret, a 78-year-old former museum curator from Boston, "is to remember that you're not a tourist, you're a traveler. Tourists consume experiences passively. Travelers engage actively with the places and people they encounter." The distinction resonated with me deeply. Kevin and Amanda were planning to be tourists in Turks and Caicos, consuming a pre-packaged experience designed to require minimal effort or adaptation. I was choosing to be a traveler, to engage with unfamiliar cultures and challenge myself, to grow through those encounters. Later that evening, back in our stateroom, Betty and I reviewed our Rome itinerary over glasses of wine from the complimentary bottle that had been waiting in our room. "You know," Betty said, "I've been thinking about Kevin and Amanda's reaction to this trip." "What about it?" I asked, though I'd been thinking about it too. "They weren't really worried about your safety or comfort. They were threatened by your independence. The idea that you might have experiences they couldn't control or oversee challenged their entire perception of your role in the family." Betty's observation was uncomfortably accurate. In the 3 years since Harold's death, Kevin and Amanda had gradually assumed increasing control over my life, not through any malicious intent, but through a combination of genuine concern and their own need to see me as someone who required their management. My independence threatened that dynamic in ways that went beyond this single vacation. "I think you're right," I admitted, "but I'm not sure what that means for our relationship going forward." "It means," Betty said, raising her glass in a toast, "that you're going to show them who Dorothy Mitchell really is. Not the diminished widow they've created in their minds, but the accomplished, capable, interesting woman who never actually went anywhere." The next morning brought our first port of call, Civitavecchia, the gateway to Rome. I woke early, energized, by the prospect of returning to a city I hadn't seen since my backpacking days nearly 50 years earlier. From our balcony, I could see the Italian coast emerging from the morning mist, all golden light and ancient promise. The debarkation process was smooth and efficient, nothing like the chaos I'd been warned to expect from cruise ship arrivals. Our small group of 12 passengers met Professor Romano at the pier, where he greeted us in accented but perfect English, while simultaneously speaking rapid Italian to our driver and guide. "Welcome to Roma," he said, his enthusiasm infectious despite the early hour. "Today we will see not just the monuments you have read about, but the living city that exists between and around them. You will leave today understanding why Rome is called the Eternal City." The drive from the port to the city center took us through landscapes that seemed painted by Renaissance masters. Rolling hills dotted with umbrella pines, ancient aqueducts marching across valleys, glimpses of the Mediterranean sparkling in the distance. I found myself pressing against the bus window like a child, trying to capture everything with my eyes and my inadequate phone camera. "Mrs. Mitchell," Professor Romano said, settling into the seat beside me, "I understand you taught language arts for many years. Have you maintained your Italian?" "I'm terribly rusty," I admitted, "but I remember more than I expected." "Ben, today you will have many opportunities to practice. Romans appreciate when visitors make the effort to speak their language, even imperfectly." Our first stop was the Colosseum, but not the crowded public areas where tour groups clustered around guides with colored umbrellas. Professor Romano led us through a private entrance to areas normally closed to the public, including the underground chambers where gladiators and animals had waited their turn in the arena above. Standing in those ancient passages, running my hands along stone walls worn smooth by centuries of touch, I felt connected to history in a way that no textbook or documentary could provide. This was experiential learning at its most powerful, the kind of education that transforms understanding rather than simply conveying information. The Colosseum wasn't just entertainment, Professor Romano explained, as we emerged onto a platform that offered an unobstructed view of the arena floor. It was social engineering. The emperor provided spectacles to keep the population distracted from political and economic problems. The phrase bread and circuses comes from this period. I thought about modern parallels, about how contemporary societies used entertainment and consumption to manage public attention and dissatisfaction. These weren't ancient problems. They were human problems that manifested differently across centuries and cultures. As the morning progressed, we visited the Roman Forum, the Palatine Hill, and finally the Vatican museums for our private tour of the Sistine Chapel. Each location offered layers of history and meaning that would have been impossible to appreciate in a rushed group tour or self-guided visit. Professor Romano's expertise brought these places alive, connecting architecture to politics, art to religion, past to present. In the Sistine Chapel, standing beneath Michelangelo's ceiling with only our small group present, I experienced something approaching reverence. The scale and complexity of the artwork was overwhelming, but what moved me most was the realization that this masterpiece had been created by someone who was considered elderly by the standards of his time. Michelangelo had been in his 70s when he completed The Last Judgment, proving that age could be a source of wisdom and creative power rather than limitation and decline. Art is not diminished by the age of its creator, Professor Romano said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Often, it is enhanced by the depth of experience and the urgency that comes with understanding mortality. During lunch at a small restaurant near the Vatican, where Professor Romano ordered for our table in rapid Italian and the proprietor treated us like honored guests rather than tourists, I found myself thinking about how this experience would sound when I described it to Kevin and Amanda. Would they be able to understand the significance of what I was doing? Or would they focus on the practical concerns they'd raised before my departure? "You're looking thoughtful," said Patricia, one of my fellow travelers, as we shared an antipasto plate that featured ingredients I couldn't identify, but flavors that were unmistakably perfect. "I was thinking about my family," I admitted, "about how different this is from what they expected I could handle." "Families often see us as we were, not as we are," Patricia replied. "My daughter still treats me like I'm the overwhelmed young mother she remembers from her childhood, even though I've been traveling independently for 20 years and speak better French than she does." The afternoon brought our visit to the Trevi Fountain, where tradition demanded that we throw coins over our shoulders to ensure our return to Rome. As I stood at the edge of that magnificent Baroque confection, surrounded by tourists from every corner of the world, I made two wishes. The obvious one, that I would indeed return to this eternal city someday. And the more complex one, that I would continue to find the courage to exceed the expectations others had set for me. The return journey to our ship that evening gave me time to process the day's experiences. I had navigated a foreign city, communicated in a language I hadn't spoken in decades, absorbed historical and cultural information at a graduate level, and thoroughly enjoyed every moment of it. The woman who had done these things was not the diminished grandmother Kevin and Amanda had characterized. She was Dorothy Mitchell in her full complexity, using skills and interests that had been dormant but never lost. Back on the ship, Betty and I had dinner in the main dining room, where our table companions were eager to hear about our Roman adventure. I found myself telling stories with an animation and enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years, describing the underground passages of the Colosseum, the private moments in the Sistine Chapel, the perfect lunch in the hidden restaurant near the Vatican. "You sound like a different person," observed James, a retired professor from Edinburgh who had become a dinner companion over the past few days. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For the first time in 3 years, I was being myself fully, without the careful self-editing that had become second nature in my interactions with Kevin and Amanda. I wasn't monitoring my stories for signs that I was talking too much or boring younger listeners. I wasn't qualifying my opinions to seem appropriately humble for someone of my age and status. I was simply Dorothy Mitchell, engaged with the world and confident in my right to be heard. That night, as I stood on my balcony, watching the lights of the Italian coast fade into darkness, I called my neighbor Maria Santos to check on things at home. Maria, who had immigrated from Spain 40 years earlier and understood something about the courage required to start over in unfamiliar territory, listened to my description of the day with genuine enthusiasm. "Dorothy, you sound so happy," she said. "So alive. Your voice is different." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like myself again." "Good. You have been too careful for too long, too worried about what other people think you should be doing instead of what you want to be doing." After hanging up, I tried calling Kevin to share some of my Roman experiences, but the call went directly to voicemail. I left a brief message describing the Vatican tour and the private access we'd been given to historical sites, keeping my tone upbeat and informative rather than defensive or apologetic. His return call came an hour later. "Waking me from the deep sleep that comes from physical activity and mental stimulation. Mom, I got your message. How are you feeling? Are you taking your medications? You sound kind of manic." Manic. Because I was excited about learning and experiencing new things. Because I was enthusiastic about art and history and culture. Because I was happy in a way I hadn't been since Harold's death. "I'm feeling wonderful, Kevin. Today was extraordinary. We had private access to parts of the Colosseum that aren't open to the public, and our guide was a professor who has been studying Roman architecture for 30 years. That's nice, Mom, but I'm worried about you overdoing it. All that walking. And stimulation can't be good for someone your age. Are you sure you're not pushing yourself too hard?" "I'm sure. I feel energized, not exhausted. This is exactly what I needed." There was a pause, and I could hear Amanda's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. "Amanda's concerned about the expenses, Mom. She looked up Mediterranean cruises online, and they're really pricey. You're going to burn through your savings if you keep making decisions like this." "My savings are my responsibility, Kevin, and they're more substantial than you realize. But Mom, you need to think about the future. What if you need long-term care? What if there are medical emergencies? You can't just spend money like it's unlimited." The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with Kevin expressing concern about my judgment, my spending, my physical limitations, and my failure to consult the family before making major decisions. By the time we hung up, my euphoria from the day's adventures had been significantly dampened. "Rough call?" Betty asked from her bed, where she'd been diplomatically pretending to read while I dealt with my family obligations. "Kevin thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown, spending too much money, taking too many risks, acting impulsively. And what do you think?" I considered the question seriously. Was I acting impulsively? Perhaps. Was I taking risks? Certainly. Was I spending money I could afford on experiences that enriched my life? Absolutely. "I think I'm finally acting like myself instead of the person they need me to be," I said finally. "Good," Betty replied, turning off her reading. Light. "Tomorrow is Barcelona. Wait until they hear about that." As I lay in the darkness, listening to the gentle sounds of the ship moving through the Mediterranean night, I thought about the choices ahead of me. I could continue this journey of rediscovery, accepting that it might strain my relationship with Kevin and Amanda. Or I could return to the careful, diminished version of myself that kept family peace, but stifled my spirit. The ship rocked gently, beneath me, carrying me toward tomorrow's adventures and away from yesterday's limitations. For the first time in 3 years, the choice felt clear. Dorothy Mitchell was just getting started. Barcelona greeted us with crisp morning air and the distinctive architecture of Antoni Gaudí rising like dreams made concrete against the Spanish sky. As our ship docked in Port Vell, I stood on my balcony watching the city wake up, its broad boulevards already busy with early commuters, and its Gothic quarter beckoning with narrow streets that had witnessed centuries of human drama. Today would bring our cooking class with Chef Miguel Roca, whose restaurant had earned 2 Michelin stars and whose reputation for teaching traditional Catalan cuisine drew culinary students from across Europe. Betty emerged from the bathroom looking refreshed and excited, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "Ready for your close-up with Spanish cuisine?" she asked, adjusting her comfortable walking shoes and checking her small backpack for the essentials we'd learned to carry during port visits. "More than ready." Something about being in Spain awakened my dormant fluency in ways that Italy hadn't quite managed. Perhaps it was the years of teaching Spanish literature, or maybe the linguistic rhythms were simply more embedded in my memory, but I felt confident about navigating this city in ways that surprised even me. Our small group of 8 passengers met Chef Roca at the famous Boqueria market, where he led us through stalls overflowing with ingredients that painted the morning in vivid colors. Deep purple eggplants, brilliant red peppers, silvery fish, arranged like jewelry on beds of ice, wheels of manchego cheese aged to golden perfection. The chef moved through the market with the easy familiarity of someone who had been shopping these aisles since childhood, greeting vendors in rapid Catalan and examining produce with the intensity of a scientist. "Cooking is not just about technique," he explained in accented English as we gathered around a stall displaying at least 20 varieties of olives. "It is about understanding ingredients, respecting their origins, knowing their stories. This olive was grown in soil that has nurtured olive trees since Roman times. When you cook with it, you become part of that continuity." I found myself translating his more complex explanations for 2 fellow passengers who were struggling with his accent, my Spanish flowing more naturally than it had in decades. The market vendors responded to my efforts with the kind of warmth reserved for visitors who make genuine attempts to communicate, offering samples of jamón ibérico and explaining the differences between various types of Spanish rice with the high patience of people who love sharing their knowledge. "Señora, your Spanish is very good," said Carmen, the woman selling us saffron that cost more per ounce than gold. "You have lived in Spain?" "Many years ago, when I was young," I replied, accepting her compliment with pleasure. "I was a teacher, and I studied here one summer in Salamanca." "Ah, Salamanca! The most beautiful Spanish in all the world is spoken there. No wonder you sound so educated." The conversation continued in Spanish, with Carmen asking about my travels and my family, expressing amazement that I was exploring the Mediterranean alone with my friend at my age. But her amazement wasn't condescending. It was admiring, the way one might admire someone who had accomplished something impressive and inspiring. "You give me hope," she said as we prepared to leave her stall. "My husband says I am too old to travel, that I should be content with my grandchildren and my kitchen. But you show me that adventure does not end at 70. Her words stayed with me as we made our way to Chef Roca's cooking school, a beautifully appointed space above his restaurant that overlooked the Gothic quarter. Here, we would spend the entire day learning to prepare a traditional Catalan feast, working with ingredients we had selected at the market and techniques that had been passed down through generations of Spanish cooks. The hands-on nature of the experience suited me perfectly. After years of theoretical knowledge about Spanish culture gained through textbooks and films, I was finally engaging with it directly, physically, through the universal language of food preparation. Chef Roca proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with our mistakes, but uncompromising about proper technique. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, watching me work on the sofrito that would form the base of our paella, "you have good hands for cooking. Very gentle with the ingredients, very patient with the process. This is not something that can be taught." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. When had anyone last praised my competence at something new, something challenging? Kevin and Amanda's interactions with me had become so focused on accommodation and limitation that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be recognized for skill rather than accommodated for incapacity. As the morning progressed, I found myself naturally taking on a leadership role within our small cooking group. My Spanish allowed me to communicate directly with the chef's assistants, and my teaching background made me comfortable explaining techniques to fellow students who were struggling. Margaret, the museum curator from Boston, commented that I seemed to have found my element. "You're like a different person when you're engaged with something that interests you," she observed as we worked together on preparing escalivada, a traditional roasted vegetable dish. "More confident, more present." She was right. I felt more present than I had in years, fully engaged with the immediate task rather than monitoring myself for signs of incompetence or fatigue. My hands were steady as I worked with sharp knives and hot pans. My mind was clear as I followed complex instructions and adapted techniques to achieve desired results. This was the Dorothy Mitchell who had managed 30 teenagers at a time, who had organized school events for hundreds of families, who had run a household and supported a husband's business dreams while pursuing her own professional development. The lunch we prepared was magnificent. Paella with perfectly cooked rice and seafood that tasted like the Mediterranean itself, escalivada that captured the essence of Spanish summer, and a flan so delicate it seemed to dissolve on the tongue, like sweet clouds. We ate on the terrace overlooking the Gothic Quarter, accompanied by wine from a vineyard that Chef Roca's family had been associated with for 3 generations. "This is how food should be experienced," the chef said, raising his glass in a toast. "Not rushed, not distracted, but with full attention to flavor, company, and place. You have cooked like Spaniards today, and now you must eat like Spaniards." After lunch, we had the afternoon free to explore Barcelona independently. Most of our group chose to visit the famous Sagrada Familia or stroll down Las Ramblas, but I had a different plan. Using the language skills that felt increasingly natural with every conversation, I navigated the metro system to reach Park Güell, Gaudi's fantastical public space that transformed an entire hillside into a work of art. The park was crowded with tourists, but I found quiet corners where I could sit and absorb the extraordinary vision that Gaudi had brought to life more than a century ago. The organic curves of his architecture, the way he had integrated buildings into landscape so seamlessly that they seemed to have grown rather than been constructed, spoke to something deep in my aesthetic sense. This was creativity uncompromised by conventional limitations, imagination given physical form through skill and determination. As I sat on one of the park's mosaic benches, looking out over Barcelona toward the Mediterranean, I called Tyler, my 17-year-old grandson. The time difference meant it was early morning in Ohio, and I caught him before school. "Grandma, how's the cruise? Mom said you were in Rome yesterday." His enthusiasm was immediate and genuine, a refreshing contrast to his parents' worried interrogations. "I'm in Barcelona today, honey. I just finished a cooking class where we made authentic paella, and now I'm sitting in this incredible park designed by an architect named Gaudí. I wish you could see it." "That sounds amazing. Are you taking lots of pictures? And are you really speaking Spanish with actual Spanish people?" "I am, and it's coming back to me better than I expected. I feel like I'm remembering parts of myself I'd forgotten I had." "That's so cool, Grandma. Mom and Dad keep saying you're overdoing it, but you sound really happy. Like really, really happy." Out of the mouths of babes, Tyler could hear what his parents couldn't, the genuine joy in my voice rather than the concern about whether that joy was appropriate or sustainable. "I am happy, Tyler. I'm learning things and seeing places and having conversations with interesting people. I feel alive in a way I haven't in a long time." "Good for you. And Grandma? When you get back, will you teach me to make that paella? I'm getting tired of Mom's quinoa salads." After we hung up, I sat for a while longer in Gaudi's wonderland. thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the different perspectives within my family. Tyler and Madison, perhaps because they were young and still forming their own ideas about possibility and limitation, could appreciate adventure and growth in their grandmother without feeling threatened by it. Kevin and Amanda settled into their own middle-aged certainties about appropriate behavior and risk management, saw my independence as dangerous rather than admirable. The evening brought an unexpected challenge. As Betty and I prepared for dinner, I received a call from Kevin that immediately changed the tone of what had been a perfect day. "Mom, we need to talk. Amanda found some information online about cruise ship medical emergencies, and we're really concerned about you being so far from proper medical facilities." I sat down on my stateroom's small sofa, already feeling my good mood deflate. "Kevin, this ship has a fully equipped medical center and doctors on staff 24 hours a day. I researched this thoroughly before booking. But what if something serious happens? What if you have a heart attack or a stroke? How would they get you to a real hospital? The same way they would get anyone to a hospital. There are established protocols for medical emergencies at sea, and we're never more than a few hours from major ports with excellent medical facilities. Mom, you're 72 years old. You're taking risks that you wouldn't take if you were thinking clearly." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. I was thinking more clearly than I had in years, making decisions based on accurate assessment of my capabilities rather than other people's fears about my limitations. "Kevin, I spent the morning learning to cook traditional Spanish cuisine from a Michelin-starred chef. I navigated Barcelona's public transportation system independently. I conducted conversations in Spanish with native speakers. These aren't the actions of someone who isn't thinking clearly. They're the actions of someone who's trying to prove something instead of accepting reality. And what reality is that, exactly?" There was a pause, and I heard Amanda's voice in the background before Kevin continued. "The reality that you're an elderly widow who should be focusing on staying safe and preserving your resources instead of gallivanting around Europe like you're 25 years old." Gallivanting. As if my carefully planned educational travel was somehow frivolous or inappropriate. As if the money I was spending on enriching experiences was being wasted rather than invested in my own life satisfaction. "I'm focusing on living fully while I'm able to do so," I replied, working to keep my voice level. "And my resources are being used exactly as I choose to use them." "About that, Mom. Amanda did some research on Mediterranean cruises, and what you're spending on this trip could pay for a year of assisted living if you ever need it. You're being financially irresponsible." And there it was. The real concern wasn't my safety or well-being. It was the money. The inheritance they'd been counting on. The security they'd assumed would be available to them if needed. The resources they'd expected me to preserve through self-denial and careful living. My finances are my responsibility, Kevin. I've been managing money successfully for decades, and I'm continuing to do so now. But Mom, you're not thinking about the future. What happens when you can't live independently anymore? What happens if you need expensive medical care? You can't just spend everything on vacations. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Kevin and Amanda taking turns expressing concern about my judgment, my safety, my spending, and my failure to consult them before making major life decisions. By the time I hung up, I was shaking with a combination of anger and hurt that threatened to overwhelm the day's accomplishments. Betty, who had been getting ready for dinner in diplomatic silence, sat down beside me on the small sofa. "That looked rough," she said gently. "They think I'm having some kind of breakdown. That I'm spending money irresponsibly and taking dangerous risks because I'm not thinking clearly. And how do you feel about that assessment?" I considered the question seriously. How did I feel? Angry, certainly. Hurt by their inability to see my choices as reasonable and their need to characterize my independence as incompetence. But underneath those immediate emotions was something more complex and more troubling. "I feel like they want me to be diminished," I said finally. "Like they need me to be less capable, less interesting, less alive than I actually am. My competence threatens their narrative about what I should be at this stage of my life." "That's a hard realization," Betty acknowledged. "But it's probably accurate. Some people need their elderly family members to be helpless because it makes them feel needed and important. Your independence challenges that dynamic." "But what does that mean for our relationship going forward? If I can't be myself without threatening their sense of control, how do we maintain any kind of healthy connection?" Betty was quiet for a moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Maybe the relationship needs to change," she said finally. "Maybe instead of you adapting to their expectations, they need to adapt to who you really are." That evening at dinner, our table companions noticed my subdued mood, despite my efforts to maintain normal conversation. James, the retired professor from Edinburgh, asked directly if everything was all right. "Family complications," I said simply. "Ah," he replied with the understanding of someone who had likely faced similar challenges. "The ones who love us most are sometimes the least able to see us clearly." Margaret, the museum curator, nodded in agreement. "My children spent years trying to convince me that I was too old to travel alone, too frail to manage international trips, too set in my ways to adapt to foreign cultures. It took several successful adventures before they stopped treating me like I was made of glass." "How did you handle the transition?" I asked. "I stopped asking for their approval and started simply informing them of my plans," she replied, matter-of-factly. "I stopped justifying my choices and started expecting them to respect my autonomy as an adult. It was difficult at first, but it was necessary." After dinner, Betty and I walked the ship's promenade deck, enjoying the warm Mediterranean evening and the sight of Barcelona's lights twinkling along the coast. The city looked magical from this distance, all the complexity and challenge of urban life reduced to a beautiful pattern of illumination against the darkness. "I've been thinking about what Margaret said," I told Betty, as we found a quiet spot along the rail. "About not asking for approval?" "About expecting respect for my autonomy. I realize I've been defending my choices instead of simply making them. I've been justifying my independence instead of exercising it. And what does that look like going forward?" I thought about the question as we watched a late ferry making its way across the harbor, its lights reflected in the dark water. "It looks like me continuing to live my life according to my own judgment and capabilities, regardless of whether Kevin and Amanda approve. It looks like me using my resources to enrich my life, rather than preserve them for theoretical future needs that may never materialize. It looks like me being Dorothy Mitchell in all her complexity instead of the simplified version that makes other people comfortable." The next morning brought news that would test this newfound resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. As we prepared to disembark for our day in Monaco, Betty answered a call from her daughter while I finished getting ready. "Dorothy," she said after hanging up, her expression troubled. "That was Linda. She said Kevin called her looking for information about our cruise. He wanted to know exactly where we're staying, what our itinerary looks like, and whether she thought you were showing signs of mental decline." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He's checking up on me, gathering information from my friends to build a case that I'm incompetent. It looks that way. Linda didn't give him any information, but she wanted to warn us that he seems to be taking a more active approach to what he calls the situation with your mother. The situation with your mother. As if I were a problem to be managed rather than a person making independent choices about my own life. "What do you think he's planning?" I asked. Betty sat down on her bed, looking older than she had since we'd started this journey. "I think he's exploring his options for intervening in your affairs. possibly looking into guardianship or conservatorship if he can make a case that you're not mentally competent to manage your own finances. The words hit me like cold water. Guardianship. The legal process by which adult children could take control of their parents' lives, stripping away autonomy and independence in the name of protection and care. I'd seen it happen to friends, watched capable older adults lose the right to make their own decisions because family members convinced courts that age alone was evidence of incapacity. Can he do that? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. If he can convince a judge that you're making dangerous or irrational decisions, yes. And unfortunately, international travel by elderly people is sometimes viewed as evidence of poor judgment rather than adventurous spirit. Standing there in my elegant stateroom, preparing for another day of cultural enrichment and personal growth, I realized that the stakes of this journey had suddenly become much higher than I'd understood. This wasn't just about proving to myself that I was still capable of independence and adventure. It was about preserving my legal right to make my own choices about how to live whatever years remained to me. Monaco awaited, with its legendary casino and its harbor full of yachts that cost more than most people's houses. But first, I needed to call my lawyer in Ohio and make sure that my autonomy was protected by more than just my own determination to exercise it. The game had changed, and Dorothy Mitchell was about to discover just how high the stakes really were. The legal office of Harrison and Associates occupied the third floor of a limestone building that had stood in downtown Columbus since the 1920s. Through the window of the conference room where I sat, I could see the familiar streets of my home state, but everything felt foreign after 3 weeks of Mediterranean ports and cultural immersion. Emergency flights from Nice to Columbus weren't cheap, but money had become secondary to preserving my fundamental right to make my own decisions about how to spend it. Robert Harrison had been my attorney for 15 years, handling Harold's estate and my own legal affairs with the steady competence of someone who understood that elderly clients were often more capable than their adult children assumed. At 71 himself, he brought a perspective to aging and autonomy that younger lawyers might lack. "Dorothy, I've reviewed the documentation Kevin submitted to the probate court," he said, adjusting his reading glasses and spreading several official-looking papers across the mahogany conference table. He's petitioned for emergency guardianship based on what he characterizes as a pattern of increasingly erratic financial decisions and disregard for your personal safety. The words stung, even though I'd been expecting them. During my frantic phone calls from Monaco, Robert had explained the legal process by which adult children could seek court-appointed control over their parents' lives. It was designed to protect vulnerable elderly people from exploitation and self-harm, but it could be weaponized by family members who disagreed with their relatives' choices. "What evidence is he presenting?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Primarily the cruise expenses, which he's characterized as financially irresponsible given your age and health status. He's also citing your decision to travel internationally without consulting family members, and he's included statements from Amanda about behavioral changes she's observed since Harold's death." "What kind of behavioral changes?" Robert consulted his notes, his expression carefully neutral. "Increased impulsiveness, disregard for safety protocols, unrealistic assessment of your physical capabilities, and what she terms grandiose ideas about your language skills and cultural knowledge." Grandiose ideas. Because I'd successfully navigated European cities using languages I'd studied and taught for decades. Because I'd engaged with art and architecture and cuisine at a level that required education and intelligence. Because I'd demonstrated competence that didn't fit their narrative of decline and dependence. "Robert, you've known me for 15 years. Do any of these characterizations match your observations of my mental state and decision-making capabilities?" He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with the careful attention of someone making a professional assessment. "Honestly, you seem more engaged and energetic than you have since Harold's death. Your thinking is clear, your memory is sharp, and your reasoning about financial matters is sound. But Dorothy, family court judges don't always see things the way we might hope. What do you mean? I mean that age bias is real in the legal system. When a 72-year-old woman spends $15,000 on a Mediterranean cruise against her family's wishes, some judges will see that as evidence of impaired judgment rather than personal choice. When she travels internationally alone, they might view it as dangerous rather than adventurous. The unfairness of it was breathtaking. A 40-year-old spending $15,000 on a vacation would be seen as successful and sophisticated. A 72-year-old making the same choice was potentially incompetent and in need of legal intervention. So what are my options? We fight it, Robert said simply. We demonstrate that your choices, while perhaps unconventional for your age group, are rational, well-considered, and within your financial means. We show that you're competent to manage your affairs and that Kevin's concerns, while possibly well-intentioned, don't justify removing your legal autonomy. And if we lose, the court appoints a guardian, probably Kevin, who would have legal control over your finances, medical decisions, and living arrangements. You'd essentially become a ward of the state, represented by someone else's judgment about what's in your best interests. The prospect was terrifying. Not just the loss of independence, but the public humiliation of being declared incompetent by a court of law. The reduction of 72 years of responsible decision-making to a legal finding that I could no longer be trusted with my own life. When is the hearing scheduled? Next week. Kevin's attorney requested an expedited hearing because of what they term the urgent nature of the situation. They're arguing that your continued unsupervised travel poses an immediate risk to your safety and financial security. I thought about the irony of that characterization. At this very moment, Kevin and Amanda were probably lounging on a beach, in Turks and Caicos, engaged in exactly the kind of leisure travel they'd declared too risky for me. The difference wasn't the activity itself, but the age of the person engaging in it. What do I need to do to prepare? We need to document your competence comprehensively. Medical evaluations, financial assessments, testimony from people who can speak to your mental acuity and decision-making capabilities. And Dorothy, we need to be strategic about how you present yourself and your choices. What do you mean? Robert chose his words carefully. I mean that while your Mediterranean cruise was clearly a positive experience for you, the court might view it differently. We need to frame your decisions not as rebellion against family concerns, but as reasonable choices made by a competent adult with adequate resources and careful planning. The next few days became a whirlwind of medical appointments, financial reviews, and legal preparations. Dr. Patterson, my physician for 15 years, conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment that demonstrated my mental faculties were not only intact but functioning at a high level for someone of any age. Dorothy, I don't know what your son is thinking, she said after completing the evaluation. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning is sound, and your physical health is better than most people 20 years younger. If taking a cruise is evidence of incompetence, then half my patients should be in conservatorship. The financial review was equally supportive. My accountant, Dorothy Chen, prepared a detailed analysis of my assets and spending patterns that showed the cruise, while expensive, represented less than 3% of my total net worth and didn't compromise my long-term financial security in any way. Mrs. Mitchell has been one of my most financially responsible clients, she noted in her written statement. Her investment strategy is conservative but effective. Her spending is well within her means, and her financial planning demonstrates clear thinking about both present enjoyment and future security. But it was the character testimony that proved most compelling. Betty Rodriguez, despite her concern about being drawn into family legal battles, provided a detailed statement about our friendship and her observations of my competence during our travels. Dorothy Mitchell is one of the most capable, intelligent, and thoughtful people I know, she wrote. Her decision to take a Mediterranean cruise wasn't impulsive or irrational. It was carefully planned, thoroughly researched, and executed with remarkable skill and judgment. She navigated foreign countries, communicated in multiple languages, and adapted to challenging situations with grace and competence. These aren't the actions of someone who lacks mental capacity. Frank Chen, my former teaching colleague who had helped arrange our cruise accommodations, provided similar testimony about my professional competence and continued intellectual engagement. Dorothy Mitchell was one of the most effective educators I worked with during 30 years in public education, he stated. Her recent travel experiences demonstrate that the skills and intelligence that made her successful in her career haven't diminished with age. If anything, her willingness to challenge herself and embrace new experiences shows the kind of mental flexibility and curiosity that characterizes healthy aging. Maria Santos, my neighbor who had been watching my house during the cruise, offered perhaps the most touching testimony. "Mrs. Mitchell is like a second mother to me," she wrote. "She has helped my family through difficult times, given wise counsel when we needed it, and shown nothing but good judgment in all the years I have known her. When she told me about her cruise plans, I wasn't worried about her safety or her judgment. I was happy that she was finally doing something adventurous and exciting for herself. She deserves joy and freedom, not legal control by people who seem to have forgotten how capable she is." The most challenging testimony to arrange was from Tyler and Madison, my teenage grandchildren. Robert had suggested that their perspectives might carry weight with the court, but reaching them required navigating Kevin and Amanda's increasing hostility toward anyone who supported my position. I managed to speak with Tyler during his lunch break at school, catching him on his cell phone when his parents wouldn't be monitoring the conversation. "Grandma, what's going on? Mom and Dad are saying weird things about you not being able to take care of yourself, but you sounded totally fine when you called from Spain. Your parents are worried about me, honey. They think I'm making bad decisions about money and travel. But you're not, are you? I mean, you seemed really happy when you were traveling. Happier than you've been since Grandpa died." The innocence of his observation was heartbreaking. A 17-year-old could see what his parents couldn't, that happiness and engagement were signs of mental health rather than decline. "Would you be willing to write a letter to a judge about what you've observed about my mental state and decision-making? It might help in a legal proceeding." There was a pause, and I could hear the weight of divided loyalty in his silence. "Will it get me in trouble with Mom and Dad?" "It might. But Tyler, sometimes doing the right thing creates conflict with people we love." "Okay, Grandma, I'll write it. Because what they're saying about you isn't true, and somebody needs to say so." Madison's support was equally touching. At 15, she had a more limited understanding of the legal implications, but her testimony about our relationship and my competence was clear and compelling. "My grandmother is the smartest person I know," she wrote in her careful teenager handwriting. "She helps me with my Spanish homework. She knows about art and history and cooking, and she remembers everything important about our family. When she went on her cruise, I wasn't worried about her. I was proud of her for doing something brave and interesting. I don't understand why my parents think she can't take care of herself when she's been taking care of all of us for years." As the hearing date approached, I found myself living in a state of suspended animation. I'd returned to my house on Maple Street, but everything felt temporary and conditional. If Kevin succeeded in his petition, this might be my last week of independent living. The next time I traveled, it would be with a guardian's permission. The next time I spent money, it would be subject to someone else's approval. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kevin and Amanda had returned from their Turks and Keiko's vacation refreshed and tan, full of stories about their resort experiences and their plans for future travel. Their objection wasn't to travel itself, but to my travel. Their concern wasn't about vacation expenses in general, but about my vacation expenses specifically. 2 days before the hearing, Amanda called to suggest a compromise. "Dorothy, we've been thinking about this whole situation, And maybe there's a middle ground, she said, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone she used when she wanted something. What if you came to live with us? We could convert the basement into a nice apartment for you, and then you'd have family nearby to help with things. The offer was presented as generosity, but I understood it for what it was. A final attempt to avoid court proceedings by getting me to voluntarily surrender my independence. If I moved in with Kevin and Amanda, they could monitor my spending, control my activities, and gradually assume management of my affairs without legal intervention. That's very kind, I replied carefully, but I'm happy in my own home. But, Dorothy, this house is getting too big for you to manage, and living alone at your age isn't safe. What if something happens and no one is there to help? I've managed quite well for 3 years, Amanda, and I have neighbors, friends, and support systems that work for me. But what about finances? You've proven that you can't be trusted to make responsible decisions about spending. We could help you budget and make sure you're not wasting money on unnecessary things. Unnecessary things like travel, culture, education, and experiences that enriched my life and expanded my horizons. Like the Mediterranean cruise that had reminded me who I could be when I wasn't constrained by other people's limitations. My financial decisions are my own responsibility, I said firmly, and they've been quite sound for 7 decades. The conversation ended with Amanda expressing frustration about my stubbornness and warning that the court might not be as patient with my unrealistic expectations as the family had been. That evening, I sat in Harold's old study, surrounded by the books and papers that represented a lifetime of learning and growth. On his desk was the photo of us from our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, young and optimistic, and certain that we had decades of adventure ahead of us. What would you think about all this, Harold? I asked the empty room. Would you be proud of me for standing up for myself, or worried that I'm being stubborn and unrealistic? I knew what his answer would be. Harold had always believed that dignity was worth fighting for, that independence was precious, and that growing older didn't mean accepting smaller dreams or lower expectations. He would have been proud of my Mediterranean cruise, amused by Kevin's concerns, and absolutely determined that I not surrender my autonomy without a fight. The phone rang, interrupting my conversation with memory. It was Robert Harrison, calling, with news that would change everything. Dorothy, I just heard from Kevin's attorney. They want to meet tomorrow to discuss a settlement. What kind of settlement? They're willing to withdraw the guardianship petition if you agree to certain conditions. Supervised spending above a certain threshold, regular medical evaluations, and consultation with family members before making major decisions about travel or living arrangements. So, they want voluntary guardianship instead of court-ordered guardianship. Essentially, yes, you'd keep nominal control of your affairs, but with significant restrictions on your independence. I considered the offer. It would avoid the public humiliation of a competency hearing and the risk of losing everything if the court ruled against me. But it would also mean accepting the premise that I needed supervision and oversight, that my judgment couldn't be trusted, that my autonomy was conditional rather than fundamental. Robert, if we go to court and lose, what happens? You lose the right to make your own decisions about virtually everything that matters. But Dorothy, if we go to court and win, you retain full legal autonomy and Kevin can't challenge your competence again without new evidence of significant decline. And what are our chances of winning? There was a pause that told me everything I needed to know. Honestly, it depends on the judge. Some are very protective of elderly people's rights. Others are more paternalistic and tend to err on the side of what they see as protection. That night, I made my decision. I would not accept voluntary restrictions on my freedom in order to avoid the possibility of having those restrictions imposed by law. I would not admit to incompetence I didn't possess in order to appease family members who confused control with care. Dorothy Mitchell was going to court to fight for her right to remain Dorothy Mitchell, with all the risks and rewards that independence entailed. If I lost, at least I would lose on my own terms, standing up for principles that had guided me through 7 decades of life. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and cold, typical for Ohio in early spring. As I dressed in my most professional suit and prepared to argue for my own competence before a judge who would decide whether I was capable of choosing my own clothes, I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. A Mediterranean cruise had become a battle for the fundamental right to live my own life. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome couldn't have been less certain. The courtroom in the Franklin County Probate Court had seen thousands of families torn apart by disputes over aging and autonomy. But as I walked through those heavy oak doors on that Tuesday morning, I felt the weight of every case that had come before mine. The room itself was imposing in the way that legal spaces are designed to be, with high ceilings, formal portraits of long-dead judges, and an atmosphere that suggested the gravity of the decisions made within these walls. Judge Patricia Whitman presided from her elevated bench with the stern competence of someone who had spent 20 years navigating the complex intersection of family dynamics and legal precedent. At 68 herself, she brought a perspective to aging that might work in my favor, but her reputation for careful adherence to legal standards meant that sympathy alone wouldn't determine the outcome. Kevin sat at the petitioner's table, with his attorney Mark Stevens, a specialist in elder law whose practice focused on protecting elderly people from their own poor judgment. The irony of needing protection from protection wasn't lost on me as I took my seat beside Robert Harrison at the respondent's table, where I was fighting for the right to be considered competent to manage my own affairs. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Whitman, called the bailiff, and I stood with everyone else in that courtroom, knowing that when I sat down again, the trajectory of my remaining years would be determined by the next few hours of testimony and legal argument. "Good morning," Judge Whitman said, settling into her chair and reviewing the documents before her. "We're here today to consider a petition for emergency guardianship filed by Kevin Mitchell on behalf of his mother, Dorothy Mitchell. Mr. Stevens, you may present your opening statement." Kevin's attorney rose with the confidence of someone who had argued similar cases dozens of times before. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his 40s, with the kind of earnest manner that suggested genuine belief in his mission to protect vulnerable elderly people from themselves. "Your Honor, this case concerns a 72-year-old widow who has begun making increasingly erratic financial and personal decisions that put her safety and security at risk. Mrs. Mitchell recently spent over $15,000 on an international cruise, traveling alone to foreign countries without proper support systems or emergency contacts. She has refused family counsel, dismissed reasonable safety concerns, and demonstrated what can only be characterized as impaired judgment regarding her physical limitations and realistic capabilities." The words stung, even though I'd been expecting them. Hearing my Mediterranean journey described as evidence of mental decline rather than personal growth felt like having my most positive experience in years twisted into something pathological and shameful. Mrs. Mitchell's behavior represents a pattern of grandiose thinking and disregard for practical limitations that began after her husband's death 3 years ago. Her family has attempted to provide appropriate guidance and support, but she has rebuffed their efforts and continues to make decisions that compromise her long-term security. We ask the court to appoint her son Kevin as guardian to ensure that her remaining years are protected from the consequences of her declining judgment. When Stevens finished, Judge Whitman looked toward our table. "Mr. Harrison, your opening statement." Robert stood with the measured dignity of an attorney who had spent decades advocating for clients whose competence was questioned simply because of their age. "Your Honor, Dorothy Mitchell is a 72-year-old woman who is being punished for refusing to accept limitations that others have tried to impose upon her. She is a retired educator with 40 years of professional experience, a financially secure widow with substantial assets and conservative spending habits, and a competent adult who has successfully managed her affairs for decades without incident. I felt a surge of gratitude for Robert's framing. He wasn't just defending my right to travel. He was defending my right to be seen as the person I actually was, rather than the diminished version others needed me to be. The evidence will show that Mrs. Mitchell's recent travel experience was carefully planned, well-researched, and executed with remarkable competence. She navigated foreign countries, communicated in multiple languages, and demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual engagement and cultural curiosity that characterizes healthy aging. Her family's concerns, while possibly well-intentioned, are based on age-related prejudices rather than actual evidence of incompetence. The first witness was Kevin himself, and watching my son testify against my competence was one of the most painful experiences of my life. He sat in the witness chair looking genuinely concerned and slightly bewildered, as if he couldn't understand how someone he loved could make choices that seemed so obviously dangerous to him. "My mother has changed significantly since my father died," he said in response to Stevens's questions. "She's become more impulsive, more secretive about her finances, and less realistic about her physical limitations. The cruise was just the most extreme example of a pattern we've been worried about for months." "Can you describe specific incidents that caused concern?" Kevin consulted notes he'd prepared, and I realized he'd been documenting what he saw as evidence of my decline with the methodical approach of someone building a legal case. She stopped consulting us about major decisions. She began talking about traveling and having adventures like she was still young. She spent money on expensive clothing and dining out more frequently than she had when Dad was alive. And then she booked this cruise without telling anyone, spending more money than she'd ever spent on herself in her entire life. The characterization was accurate but incomplete. I had stopped consulting them because their advice consistently involved accepting smaller dreams and lower expectations. I had begun talking about adventure because I'd finally admitted to myself that I missed it. I had spent money on clothes and experiences because I finally felt free to invest in my own happiness, rather than preserving every dollar for a future that was far from guaranteed. "Did you observe any signs of confusion or memory problems?" "Not exactly confusion, but poor judgment. She seemed to think she could handle situations that would be challenging for someone half her age. She talked about speaking foreign languages, like she was still the teacher she'd been decades ago. She didn't seem to understand the risks she was taking." Under cross-examination, Robert challenged Kevin's interpretations with surgical precision. "Mr. Mitchell, you testified that your mother showed poor judgment in believing she could handle foreign travel. Are you aware that she successfully completed a 30-day Mediterranean cruise, visiting 7 countries without incident?" "Yes, but that doesn't mean it wasn't risky." "Are you aware that your mother speaks Spanish, French, and Italian, languages she taught professionally for 30 years? Kevin hesitated. "She used to speak those languages, but that was a long time ago." "Did you test her language abilities before concluding they had deteriorated?" "No, but..." "Mr. Mitchell, you testified that your mother spent an unprecedented amount of money on this cruise. Are you familiar with her actual financial situation?" "I know she has savings and pension income." "Are you aware that the cruise represented less than 3% of her total net worth?" Kevin's surprise was visible. "I didn't know the exact percentage." "Are you aware that your mother's financial advisor considers her one of her most responsible clients?" "I don't know about that." By the time Robert finished with Kevin, the picture had shifted subtly but significantly. My son's concerns began to seem less like reasonable worry and more like incomplete understanding of my actual capabilities and resources. Amanda's testimony was more problematic. She'd prepared more carefully than Kevin, consulting online resources about age-related, cognitive decline, and presenting herself as someone who'd researched the issues thoroughly. Dorothy has shown several warning signs of what experts call anosognosia, which is the inability to recognize one's own limitations, she said. using terminology she'd clearly memorized from websites about dementia and age-related decline. She overestimates her abilities, dismisses valid safety concerns, and makes decisions based on outdated assessments of her capabilities. Stevens nodded approvingly. Can you give specific examples? She insisted she could navigate foreign cities alone, but older adults are at high risk for falls, getting lost and being victimized by criminals who target tourists. She claimed she could communicate in foreign languages, but language skills decline with age, especially under stress. She believed she could handle the physical demands of extensive travel, but the medical facilities on cruise ships are limited, and her medications could have been compromised by changes in climate and routine. The testimony was more sophisticated than Kevin's, incorporating enough legitimate medical information to sound credible while applying it in ways that were both patronizing and inaccurate. Amanda had essentially argued that age itself was evidence of incompetence, that any risk-taking by elderly people was inherently irrational. Robert's cross-examination focused on Amanda's qualifications to make medical assessments and her knowledge of my actual health status. Mrs. Mitchell, what is your educational background in geriatric medicine or cognitive assessment? I don't have formal training, but I've done extensive research online. Are you aware that Dorothy Mitchell's physician has certified her as mentally and physically competent for independent living and travel? Doctors don't always recognize early signs of decline. Are you qualified to second-guess a medical professional who has treated Mrs. Mitchell for 15 years? Amanda's answers became increasingly defensive as Robert demonstrated that her concerns were based on internet research and general assumptions about aging rather than specific knowledge of my health or capabilities. The medical testimony proved crucial. Dr. Patterson took the stand with 30 years of geriatric medicine behind her, and the authority that comes from daily experience with the actual rather than theoretical challenges of aging. I conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment of Dorothy Mitchell last week, she testified. Her memory, reasoning, judgment, and decision-making capabilities are all within normal ranges for her age group. In fact, her cognitive function is superior to many people 20 years younger. Stevens tried to challenge her assessment. Doctor, isn't it possible that Mrs. Mitchell could have good days and bad days, appearing competent during your evaluation while struggling with daily decision-making? That's certainly possible with some conditions, but I've been treating Mrs. Mitchell for 15 years. I've observed her through her husband's illness and death, through various health challenges, and through the recent changes in her lifestyle. There's no evidence of the kind of cognitive fluctuation you're describing. But isn't international travel risky for someone her age? Dr. Patterson smiled slightly. Mr. Stevens, I have patients in their 80s who travel internationally, regularly. Age alone is not a contraindication for travel if someone is in good health and mentally competent. Mrs. Mitchell's recent cruise experience actually demonstrates exactly the kind of intellectual engagement and physical activity that promotes healthy aging. The character witnesses provided the emotional core of our defense. Betty Rodriguez took the stand with the confidence of someone who had spent 40 years assessing people's capabilities and matching them with appropriate travel experiences. Dorothy Mitchell is one of the most competent travelers I've ever known, she testified. She researched every aspect of our trip, handled complex logistics with ease, and adapted to challenges with grace and intelligence. She communicated effectively in multiple languages, navigated unfamiliar cities independently, and demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural curiosity and intellectual flexibility that characterizes successful aging. Stevens attempted to portray Betty as an enabling friend who had encouraged reckless behavior, but her professional background and measured responses made that characterization impossible to sustain. Frank Chen's testimony was particularly powerful because of his professional credentials and long association with me. I worked with Dorothy Mitchell for 20 years in the Columbus school system, he said. She was one of our most effective teachers, Known for her organizational skills, her ability to handle complex situations, and her talent for connecting with people from diverse backgrounds. Nothing about her recent travel experiences surprises me. They're consistent with the competent, curious, and adventurous person I've always known her to be. But it was Tyler's testimony that proved most compelling. At 17, he possessed the kind of unfiltered honesty that adults often lose, and his observations carried the weight of someone with no agenda beyond telling the truth. "My grandma is really smart," he said simply when asked to describe his interactions with me. "She helps me with my Spanish homework. She knows about history and art and cooking, and she remembers everything important about our family and our lives. When she went on her cruise, I wasn't worried about her. I was excited for her because she seemed so happy about it." Stevens tried to suggest that teenagers weren't qualified to assess their grandparents' competence, but Tyler's responses revealed a clear understanding of my capabilities that contrasted sharply with his parents' characterizations. "Has your grandmother ever seemed confused or forgetful to you?" "No more than anyone else. Less than my parents sometimes." "Are you concerned about her ability to live independently?" "Not at all. She takes better care of herself than most people I know." Judge Whitman listened to all the testimony with the careful attention of someone who understood that her decision would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. When the evidentiary phase concluded, she asked if I wanted to make a statement on my own behalf. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment, and the eyes of everyone in that courtroom focused on me. This was my opportunity to speak for myself, to defend not just my competence, but my right to define what competence meant in my own life. "Your Honor, I understand that my family's concerns come from a place of love. They want to protect me from harm, and I appreciate that motivation. But protection can become prison if it's based on fear rather than realistic assessment of capabilities and risks." I looked directly at Judge Whitman, woman to woman, hoping she could understand what it meant to be underestimated because of age and gender. I spent 40 years as an educator, successfully managing classrooms full of teenagers, navigating school politics, and handling crisis situations that would challenge anyone of any age. I've managed household finances for decades, supported my husband through his final illness, and maintained my independence through 3 years of widowhood without incident. The words came more easily than I'd expected, as if the months of having my competence questioned had prepared me for this moment of self-advocacy. My Mediterranean cruise wasn't an act of reckless impulsivity. It was a carefully planned journey that allowed me to use skills and interests I'd developed over a lifetime. I navigated foreign countries successfully, communicated in languages I've studied and taught, and engaged with art and culture at a sophisticated level. These experiences didn't diminish me. They reminded me of who I am when I'm not constrained by other people's fears about my limitations. I paused, gathering my thoughts for the most important part of my statement. "Your Honor, the question before this court isn't whether my choices are what other people would make for themselves or for me. The question is whether I'm competent to make my own choices, even if those choices involve risk, expense, or outcomes that others might not prefer. I submit that competence isn't about making decisions that others approve of. It's about having the mental capacity to understand the consequences of your choices and accept responsibility for them." When I sat down, the courtroom was quiet in a way that suggested my words had carried weight. Judge Whitman spent several minutes reviewing her notes before announcing that she would recess for 1 hour to consider her decision. That hour felt like the longest of my life. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Robert, unable to eat or make small talk, knowing that when we returned to the courtroom, I would either walk out as a free woman or as someone whose legal autonomy had been stripped away by judicial decree. When court reconvened, Judge Whitman looked directly at me as she began to speak. This case presents the difficult challenge of balancing legitimate family concerns with individual autonomy. The petitioner has raised reasonable questions about the respondent's recent behavioral changes and financial decisions. However, after careful consideration of all the evidence presented, I find that Dorothy Mitchell is mentally competent to manage her own affairs. The relief was so overwhelming that I felt dizzy, but Judge Whitman wasn't finished. The evidence demonstrates that Mrs. Mitchell's recent travel experience, while perhaps surprising to her family, was well-planned, successfully executed, and consistent with her educational background and personal interests. Her financial decisions, while involving significant expenditures, are well within her means and do not compromise her long-term security. Her medical and cognitive evaluations show no evidence of impaired judgment or decision-making capacity. She looked toward Kevin's table with the stern expression of someone delivering an important message. The court understands that watching elderly family members make choices that seem risky or unfamiliar can be distressing. However, age alone is not grounds for guardianship. Competent adults have the right to make decisions that others might consider unwise, provided they understand and accept the consequences of those decisions. Judge Whitman's final words would stay with me for the rest of my life. Mrs. Mitchell, you are hereby found competent to manage your own affairs. The petition for guardianship is denied. You remain free to make your own choices about your finances, your living arrangements, and your activities, regardless of whether others approve of those choices. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like liberation. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Kevin approached me with an expression I couldn't read. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, or at least acknowledge that he'd misjudged the situation. Instead, he looked tired and frustrated. I hope you're happy, Mom. You've won your right to make mistakes without anyone trying to stop you. Kevin, I haven't won the right to make mistakes. I've won the right to make choices. There's a difference. Is there? What happens when you get hurt traveling alone? What happens when you spend all your money on adventures and don't have anything left for care? What happens when you're too proud to admit you need help? The conversation felt futile. Kevin couldn't see past his own fears to recognize my actual capabilities, and I couldn't make him understand that living with risk was preferable to existing without autonomy. 6 months later, I was standing on the deck of another ship, this one bound for Alaska with Betty beside me, and a sense of freedom I'd never fully appreciated until it was threatened. The legal victory had done more than preserve my independence. It had forced my family to confront their assumptions about aging and capability. Tyler and Madison had become more supportive than ever, inspired by their grandmother's willingness to fight for her right to define her own life. Kevin and Amanda remained distant, but had stopped actively interfering in my decisions, perhaps recognizing that further attempts at control would be both futile and legally problematic. Most importantly, the court case had clarified something crucial for me. I wasn't just fighting for the right to take cruises or spend money on travel. I was fighting for the principle that competent adults should be allowed to live according to their own values and priorities, regardless of their age or the approval of their families. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly before our ship. Wild and untamed and full of possibilities I was finally free to explore. At 73, I was still discovering who Dorothy Mitchell could be when she wasn't constrained by other people's limitations. Behind me was a legal victory that had established my right to autonomy. Ahead was an adventure that would test and expand my capabilities in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And all around me was the vast possibility that comes from refusing to accept diminishment as an inevitable consequence of aging. The family had said I was too old for vacation, but Dorothy Mitchell had proved them wrong about vacation and everything else they thought they knew about the limits of possibility at any age. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.